Yep,
right.
you're good to go.
Got it. Okay, welcome everybody to Dear Editor. This is an ongoing conversation series about scientific writing and publishing. We just cover various topics. Today we're going to be talking about what should I include in the supplemental material for my manuscript. And I'm Erica Goodoff. I'm an editor in the Research Medical Library, and joining me today is Sarah Bronson, who's also an editor in the library, and we're going to be talking about supplemental materials. And if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat as we're going along, and we should have some time at the end of the session also. And the session is being recorded, and if you're not part of the Dear Editor team on your teams, we have a link to that at the end as well, where we will share the recording, the slides, and we also put together a handout for today's talk. So you can go back and review those resources afterwards if you want to go back and look at it again. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah to get us started.
Hi. All right, so we're just going to start with a poll of what kinds of things you have submitted over the course of submitting manuscripts to journals. What have you used as supplemental material? And I think we need to launch that. There we go.
Pick any of these that you've submitted as supplemental materials. We'll just give you a few minutes to respond to that.
Yes, and you can pick more than one.
Mm-hmm.
I am definitely going to be curious about the breakdown between the critical figures and tables versus not critical.
Yes, same. And it looks like we had one write-in. Somebody also submitted software as a supplemental thing. Wasn't one of our options. And also, sorry for the confusion. It looks like we somehow got media on there twice. So we got a duplicate. That's all right. We're just looking for a kind of survey here, see what people's experience is with this. Okay. So I'll give just another couple of seconds on this, and then we can share the results. Okay, let's see what people said. So it looks like most common answer was tables and figures. So we had a third of you said tables and figures that were critical, tables and figures that weren't critical. So most common things. And there were a couple of people who also mentioned media and methods, which is about what I would have expected. So, all right.
Yeah, it's really about a even, well, I don't think this is statistically significant, but it's about an even split between the various types of things that we definitely expect to see.
Right. We'll put that away for now.
All right, well, we'll start with some basic defining what is supplemental materials. And the answer can be very broad, and it can kind of boil down in a lot of ways too. It depends, but there have been a couple of stabs at it, most notably from a guideline published by the National Information Standards Organization, which says that supplemental materials, they often include multimedia, text, tables, and figures that would occupy too much space or interrupt the flow of the narrative in a traditional print article. And this is a really good document. It was the product of a working group from NISO together with the National Federation of Advanced Information Services. And although it's about 10 years old now, I've I find that the ideas and frameworks it provides for thinking about supplemental material really have held up pretty well. And importantly, it isn't prescriptive, as in it tells you this type of thing must always be supplemental, this type of thing must always be in the main text. It's really more a descriptive bird's eye view of the practices of scholarly publishers and journal editors, and importantly, kind of the common principles informing those practices. And the AMA Manual of Style gives some further guidance, but it's actually it's based very much on those NISO guidelines. It cites and quotes them quite a bit and amplifies them. But yes, in a nutshell, as these guidelines say, the label supplemental materials is there to help shape your content into a narrative that has a compelling flow while minimizing what would feel like more of a digression or an interruption. And even in the digital age, when you could theoretically fit an infinite amount of information into your main section, it is by no means advisable to do so. Just as print journals would have had hard page and still do have hard page limits, readers have hard limits on their attention, and editors have limits on the resources they're able to expend to process those materials. So it is important to organize your manuscript into what you want to be part of the kind of the main story and what is more of a extension of it. And the category of supplemental materials kind of arose along hand in hand with the advent of electronic media. And in fact, the AMA manual uses supplementary as kind of a synonym for online only. So you can think of supplementary material as kind of having been prefigured by the appendix that was placed at the end or physically separated from the body of an article in a physical journal. But things are not black and white, and this distinction has become less clear. So, for example, it's very common for not only inessential, but also essential material to be placed in the supplemental materials section. And we're going to dig in now to the NISO framework for understanding these two types of supplemental material. There is integral supplemental material, and that is, quote, essential for the full understanding of the work by the general scientist or reader in the journal's discipline, but it is placed outside the article for technical, business, or logistical reasons. Whereas additional supplemental material provides additional relevant and useful expansion of the article and may aid any reader to achieve deeper understanding of the current work through added detail and context. However, it is not essential to a basic understanding of the article. Now, you're not going to see these labels, integral and additional, in the way the journal organizes your materials or subheadings or anything like that, but it is a good framework because it acknowledges there are different reasons for putting certain materials in the supplements. Some material may be peripheral to what you want to focus on, or it may not be. It may be genuinely very important and necessary for replication, necessary for a complete understanding of what was done, but you just logistically needed to make a choice about what to put up front. And these definitions are going to be open to interpretation. Yours, the journals, the readers, what one person might consider integral, another might consider additional. And journals also may have different approaches to how these types of materials should be handled. Some journals may conceive of their supplemental section as entirely consisting of additional the additional category, whereas others may kind of embrace the blend of integral and additional. And if you want to make sure you're matching what is expected, then often journal instructions will clarify that. And if you're not sure, and if they don't, you can also look, of course, at what has been published and mirror those practices. Now, apart from the sheer necessity of having too much that you couldn't fit within the main materials limits, there are also a lot of benefits to taking advantage of the additional space that is afforded to you by supplemental materials. Most critically, supplemental materials are there to help other scientists to reproduce your results, provide the full details and methods needed to hopefully get the same results you did. And of course, reproducibility and replicability, as we know, is the gold standard of the scientific method, which supplementary material makes possible through access to that level of detail. Supplementary material also help contextualize an article the way footnotes or an appendix does in a book. This can provide clarification. It can help clear up something that might otherwise be confusing. And having more detail in your paper published in the form of supplemental material also improves the discoverability of your article. If someone doesn't subscribe to the journal that you've submitted to, but they simply are searching for your topic, they may do so through backlinking. They may pull up your article through backlinking of your supplementary materials. And finally, having your material in the form of a supplement makes it available to plagiarism detectors, which kind of limits the opportunities for that material to be used in a way that you would not want it to be, because it is now kind of credited to you in that way. There is an article linked at the bottom from the Impactio blog that kind of goes over these various benefits. Now we're going to go over some examples of all the different types of things that you might find in the supplements. Some journals may want your methods section to be entirely presented in the form of a supplement, or they may want you to have kind of a basic methods section and then the full methods details provided in a supplement. And then I noticed that a number of people had used supplements to provide video, audio, or interactive diagrams, and that's definitely a benefit. Another term for distinguishing between like tables, figures, text, and videos or audio is flat versus non-flat media. You may see that term from time to time, and that is another benefit of having a supplement available. Lengthy programming code, a systematic review where you have a whole page of search terms that you've used that you absolutely need to provide the details of those terms, but you don't really want to take up a page necessarily of your article on that. Also the surveys that are used in behavioral research, it is important that that you provide the exact ways that questions were posed to people. So for the purposes of reproducibility, and of course, tables and figures make up a very large amount of supplementary materials, and that can include things from this list. Oftentimes patient demographic data is provided in the form of the table 1, but sometimes that's going to be the supplementary table 1 if really there's nothing unexpected or or particularly interesting about it, but it's still essential to understand the population that you studied. Statistical results that were all non-significant. Oftentimes, you'll reserve your main figure and table slots for results that were a little bit more eye-catching. Lists of antibodies, reagents, those catalog numbers, manufacturers, those identification numbers, absolutely essential for replicability, but very space consuming. Results of verifications, just showing that you do indeed have the cell lines are behaving in a way that you premise that they are. And of course, those very long tables of perhaps here are all of the 200 genes that we found, and here is the level of correlation each one of them had with our outcome, etc. So you may be familiar with these types of supplemental materials. But I also like to think of supplemental materials as performing these particular functions. For example, providing the full detail that are needed for replication that you can still get a rough idea of across in the main text. Or you may be showing things you fully expected to find, or validating base assumptions before you go on to proceed with the really interesting part of your work. Or perhaps reviewers had a concern that, well, maybe what's actually going on here was this and not what you say it is. So this can be a good space to lay reviewers' concerns to rest, showing an alternative pathway is not in play, or there isn't an off-target effect that's raising an issue. Or just you could be expanding on a finding that you found in the cell line that you were really focused on, and perhaps you want to demonstrate that in a second subtype of the disease, the therapy was also effective. And that is, this is a very similar additive finding rather than a whole new thing. So it supports what you found, but perhaps it's more secondary. All right, and I think I'll be passing it over to Erica.
All right. See if I can get the slides to advance. Sorry. Sometimes it's got a bit of a delay for me. Okay, come on. Yeah, it's not doing it. Sarah, can you go on to the next slide?
Yeah, sure thing.
Thanks. Okay. So, we said earlier that journals have different approaches to whether they consider supplemental material, integral or additional. And that can vary by journal. So it's important to know what your journal's approach is when you're thinking about which journal you're going to submit your information or your manuscript to. Sometimes a journal will say, if you have over a certain number of figures and tables, you have to submit those as supplemental material. And so it's helpful to know if they're taking this approach, and that's because supplemental materials, tables and figures, aren't usually edited by journal staff, and oftentimes they're not even peer reviewed, or they're looked at just briefly, or they just sort of glance at it. So it's kind of helpful to know that ahead of time when you're thinking about submitting a manuscript and whether you want to include supplemental material. And really the key question here is, could a reader understand this as is without looking at the additional context or without, peer review? And that's an important question to ask yourself when you're thinking, should I put this in supplemental? Should I try to include it? If you don't want your figures or tables to become supplemental information, you might have to consider combining two of your tables together, combining your figures together if you can, or presenting the information in text or something if it's like a really small table. And that can sometimes be a way to prevent that. But this question about whether people are going to look at it, according to a survey in BMJ Open back in 2018, so just a couple of years ago, only about a quarter to a third of readers said that they routinely looked at all of the supplemental information with manuscript. Some things were more commonly reviewed than others. Like, for example, some readers, more readers indicated that they looked at supplemental tables or figures than at checklists or raw data or other things. But the implication there is that supplemental material may or may not be something that your readers pay attention to. So with that in mind, it's still not working for me. Can you go to the next slide? Sorry. All right. This I can do. Let's launch our second poll. So I would like to have a straw poll from you guys watching today. Do you find supplemental material useful when you read published material? What do you guys think about that? Right. Looks like about half of you have answered this. And so far we seem to have a fairly even split of answers on it, which is kind of interesting. Okay. Well, we're getting towards the end. I will end the poll there. Most common answer we got was sometimes. And yes, often, and no, usually not. We're kind of tied for second. So obviously, again, straw poll here. We don't have the kind of sample size here that BMJ Open did. But the key point here is people sometimes look at supplemental material and sometimes don't. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about whether you want to include supplemental information or what information that you want to make supplemental. I'm going to have to ask you to go to the next slide again. Right. All right. So that being said, when you're preparing your supplemental material, again, keep in mind, journal editors, likely aren't going to copy edit this, or at least if they do, they're not going to look at it with the same level of detail that they look at your main text. So if you have something like a really large table, you want to make sure that, first of all, most importantly, that you don't have something in that table that is actually PHI or something else that you really don't want to share when you're putting this raw data together. And that's really up to you to check. Most likely someone else isn't going to check it or even catch it if they do. So that's the first thing. And consider this for videos and audio or other media as well as your tables and figures. Even if it's supplemental material, you're still going to need your patient's permission because this is considered published material and it can still be subject to permissions and copyright and all those things, just like your main text. There's also, so permissions and PHI certainly are important key things to think about, just like with anything else that you're going to publish. Another important thing to remember is the labeling can vary. Probably even within this talk this morning, we've gone back and forth calling it supplemental material, supplementary material. The terms really are interchangeable, but you probably want to pick one and stick with it within one paper. And of course, journals are all over the place in how they point readers to supplemental material. Sometimes it's table S1, sometimes it's supplemental table S1, sometimes it's just supplemental table 1. There's a whole different bunch of ways you can do it. So again, you want to keep it consistent, and you also want to make sure that if you have a bunch of supplemental pieces of information, tables or figures, that you're referring to it consistently within your text. As again, most likely this is something that's not going to be checked or is going to not be checked very carefully when it goes through peer review. And if journal even does any extensive editing, some do and some don't. So that's something to look for when you're submitting this information. Make sure it's all consistent and a reader isn't going to get confused looking at that. So that's important to remember. And just generally, you want to check your supplemental data, your tables and your figures for typos, because again, they may or may not be looked at all that carefully by the journal editors. Okay. Still won't let me go to the next slide. Sorry. All right. So supplemental material versus data sharing. I just want to make a quick note that these are two different things. Data sharing is where you point your readers to some other website or some other server where you're storing a whole bunch of raw data. So it isn't going to be attached to your manuscript like a supplemental file would be. It's not housed within the journal, and it's definitely not going to be reviewed in any way. So I wanted to make that distinction just in case anybody was confused about it. And journals have policies about NIH, about data sharing, just like they have about supplemental information. So I'll refer you again to look at journal instructions. As far as data sharing goes, that's a whole other topic, and we definitely don't have time to cover it in 2 minutes. But there is there's an article in The Right Stuff that I'll point you to in a second that has information about data sharing, and specifically the NIH policy on data sharing, which was updated just I think last month. So if you want to go and review that information, that's available to you as well. But for the purposes of today, keep in mind data sharing, supplemental data or supplemental material, not necessarily, or definitely not the same thing. So I just want to make that distinction. Okay. And with that, that is the end of our talk. I do want to open it up to questions, leave at least a couple of minutes for that. So if you have any questions, definitely pop them into the chat. And I also wanted to point you to, again, The Right Stuff. We had an article last summer that was all about supplemental materials, some of the information that we presented here today, as well as this information about data sharing. So there's all kinds of information there. And as I said earlier this morning, after we get done with the talk today, we'll share this recording, the slides, and we have a handout with all of the references that we referred to today and some of the things that we kind of mentioned are useful additional information. But for right now, does anybody have any questions about supplemental materials that you want to ask while we're here live in front of you? Okay. Not seeing anything in the chat at the moment. In that case, I'm going to again point you to the Dear Editor team that we have there. If you watch, an episode of this, if you watch a session of this and you come up with a question afterwards that you didn't think of at the time, or even if something that we maybe covered previously, feel free to go onto the team and ask the question, and we can answer it there. And also, again, we have past recordings, past handouts and slides available there for you as well as a resource. So with that, it's 1 o'clock, and I think we'll wrap up our recording for today. I want to thank everybody for joining this morning or afternoon, I guess this afternoon, and participating in our polls. And we are going to be back next month with this series, and we're going to be talking about AI tools and things like the AI writing tools like ChatGPT and that sort of thing. That's kind of a hot topic. So we'll be back with that next month. And thank you everyone for coming today.